Bonjour, bon matin, good morning.
Good morning.
You all had a nice weekend, and I hope you all didn't miss me much. I'm back to make life more difficult for all of you. Bon matin, cher
Good morning to the witnesses. Thank you for being here this morning.
Today is meeting number 6 of the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format and is in public. At 12 noon, we are scheduled to proceed in camera to discuss committee business. For those in person, please follow the health and safety guidelines for using earpieces written on the cards that are found on the table. Le comité reprend son étude.
The committee is resuming its study on effectiveness, potential improvements, and the capability of Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan. Our witnesses today are from the Canadian Climate Institute, Mr. Dave Sawyer, Principal Economist, welcome. From the Macdonald Laurier Institute, Heather Exner-Pirot, Director, Energy, Natural Resources and Environment.
Zoom.
And we will be hearing you on Zoom. Can you hear me well? Perfect. And from the Transition Accelerator, Mr. Mo Kabara, President. Each of the witnesses will have 5 minutes for their opening remarks.
With Dave Sawyer, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. So today I want to speak to you about Canada's state of play in climate policy. It's a story of fragile progress, rising risk, and what it takes to stay on track. And it really comes down to 3 messages that I want you to remember and think about. First, the Federation's climate progress is real but fragile. We've grown the economy while cutting emissions, but progress has stalled with emissions flatlined in 2024 at 2023 levels. The system that built this momentum, shared cooperation between the provinces, federal government and territories for over 2 decades, is losing traction. Second, momentum is going the wrong way. Policy rollbacks and record oil and gas output continues to erase gains. Current policies won't meet the 2030 target, and the drift is becoming structural. We found some technical indicators to point momentum's pushing the wrong way. Third, Canada can stay on the rails. The architecture exists, the tools are proven. What needs now is focus, coordination, and goodwill, perhaps, across all orders of government. And so that's the story. Fragile progress, wrong momentum, and a path to stay on track. So our estimates of 2024 emissions show the emissions flatlined in 2024 at 694 megatons, well off of the 2030 target, about 8% below 2005 levels, just over 8%. This stall comes as wildfires highlight the rising costs of inaction, and of course the economy slows under U.S. tariffs. Competitiveness and affordability risks mount. For nearly 20 years, we've decoupled growth from emissions, but again, that decoupling weakened last year, and we can see emissions continue to rise as the economy grows. We can't fight against those rising emissions with falling policy. So policies matter to success, as do technologies that are showing up in the country and being driven by Canadian innovation. So policy and technology drivers have been pushing down emissions in time. Electricity is a big success story. Decades of federal and provincial action have worked together to drive down emissions to 60% below 2005 levels. Nationally, we're at 8%. And this has really come based on cooperation, federal backstop policies, and provincial will to drive forward, and cheap renewables coming onto the grid, basically making life easier. So momentum going the wrong way. So emissions in oil and gas, in particular oil sands, are up 150% since 2005. The sector now produces a third of national emissions, very important economically, of course, and record highs of production last year. Records show that, and our analysis shows that the sector alone contributed about 3 megatons of emissions last year in 2024. All other sectors were down in the economy or flat, and so really gains were wiped out by the one sector. Conventional oil and gas is doing a good job with methane regulations. Emissions are coming down in time. So the bottom line, other sectors are bending the curve, and our biggest emitter is really going in the wrong direction, pulling our national emissions away from that target. So where are we compared to 2030? So a year ago, our independent assessment of the emissions reduction plan, your study, found us roughly to be 3/4 of the way to our 2030 target, and about a 35% reduction on a 40% target. Today, our latest estimates show about a 20 to 25% reduction against the 2005 baseline in 2030. So what's explaining this? Why? So federal and provincial policy rollbacks and delays and new high-emitting LNG projects coming on that are already slated for construction, large lumpy emission increases. So in particular, the provincial large emitter programs are being weakened as we speak, and this really puts a hole in future emissions. And of course, we have the rollback in the federal carbon charge, BC's carbon charge, and then a whole bunch of delay on key policies like the EV availability standard. I'm sort of saying, and I like to say now, we're sort of having these policy bonfires and wildfire season. And sort of this the twin ideas of rolling back policy while we see record fires, and we're all living with smoke on a monthly basis through the summer. So where to now? So every ton matters. So climate policy isn't a pass or fail test against the targets. Every ton matters, and that is avoided. Avoids damages in Canada and globally. So, it's not really about targets. They're a North Star to guide policy. It's really about driving emissions down in time. So climate change isn't really tomorrow's problem. We're seeing all these climate realities hitting us. So smart, steady policy matters now more than ever. So how do we do this? Shared responsibility, proven tools across the jurisdictions.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Time is up. Next, I'll go with Mrs. Heather Exner-Pirot. À vous la parole.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, committee members, for the opportunity to speak to you today. The Government of Canada once described its 2030 emissions reduction plan as presenting an ambitious and achievable roadmap. It was half right. The plan was ambitious, but it will not be achieved. It is hampering the Canadian economy just the same. The previous Liberal government made achieving climate targets the centerpiece of its policy agenda. The economy and national security took a back seat. That policy preference has had far-reaching implications, and Canada has gotten poorer and weaker. The government has now committed to meeting higher NATO spending targets, becoming an energy superpower, and becoming the fastest growing economy in the G7. None of these goals are compatible with the 2030 emissions reduction plan. In polling from Abacus this past weekend, when asked what the top issues facing Canada are, climate change and environment had fallen to 9th. The cost of living, the economy, housing affordability, and unemployment preoccupy Canadians' thoughts. I still want to believe a clean environment and strong economy can go hand in hand, but I'm certain a strong economy and the emissions reduction plan cannot. Rather, the emissions reduction plan has unleashed what I call the 4 horsemen of the Canadian economy. First, the clean electricity regulations have driven up electricity costs to record levels. It has also made it harder to build adequate power generation in Canada at a time when AI demand is skyrocketing. Not only are we missing out on a generational outlay of private capital in the hundreds of billions of dollars, but we are rendering ourselves more and more dependent on the United States for what is clearly a strategic capability. Second, the EV mandate is pushing against the tide of consumer preference and is totally detached from market realities. Even before the auto industry faced uncertainty and disruption from American tariffs, the EV mandate was adding pressure and costs and impeding their competitiveness. Now, with the tariffs in place, the mandate is an existential threat. Third, the emissions cap, while still in draft form, has added tremendous uncertainty to the Canadian oil and gas sector and impeded the attraction of capital. Industry has repeatedly said that they cannot meet the cap without shutting in production. Our LNG and oil will not be globally competitive with the cap in place, and capital will flow to places with lower environmental and ethical standards. Finally, while the government suspended the consumer carbon tax in the spring due to its unpopularity, there seems to be an idea that the industrial carbon tax will pick up the slack in Canada's emissions targets. The carbon market only works if heavy emitters are willing to purchase credits. The higher the industrial carbon price goes, the less viable their Canadian operations are, and at some point that capital simply leaves to carbon agnostic jurisdictions. At a certain price, the industrial carbon tax will mostly be effective, at pushing heavy industry to places with lower environmental and ethical standards. Global emissions will not be affected. I believe GHG emissions drive a climate change, and I think it is in our interest to come up with strategies to address it. I don't think it's enough to just point out where the current plan has failed. We should all seek to offer alternative policies in good faith. But those policies must aim to make Canada's energy-intensive and heavy-emitting sectors better, not smaller. It is woefully obvious that the 2030 emissions reduction plan has had a devastating impact on the Canadian economy. In general, climate policies adopted by Western nations since the Paris Agreement have shifted industrial production to less environmentally friendly jurisdictions, have made our economies less competitive, and have made our industrial supply chains dependent on our adversaries. As a consequence, we are seeing retreats from climate ideology across Europe and the United States. Canada must not be left behind. Economic decline will not lead us to the innovation, investments, and infrastructure needed for a better future. To finish, I would like to quote Enbridge CEO Greg Ebel, who remarked at a speech last week that we are in this situation due to, quote, a decade where political vanity ran roughshod over economic utility, end quote. Canadians want, more than anything else, a strong economy and a sense of hope for their future. The emissions reduction plan stands in the way. Please don't allow political vanity to prevent us from finding a way to build and grow again. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Alexander-Pirot. Et maintenant la parole à Monsieur Cabara pour 5 minutes.
And now, Mr. Cabara, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Today I want to discuss how we can strengthen the 2030 emissions reduction plan through what I would call a competitiveness imperative, ensuring really climate policies simultaneously are strengthening our economy while driving the transformation needed towards a low-carbon future. You know, as mentioned, effective climate policy really needs to balance between ambition and achievability, and when targets feel disconnected from practical pathways, we risk paralyzing action rather than mobilizing it. And the key is focusing where transformation is both technically feasible but also economically advantageous. And we need to feel the urgency, yes, but we also need to tackle problems that are truly solvable. That's where we can mobilize action. So let's talk about emissions. Oil and gas production represents roughly 30% of Canada's emissions. It's the largest single contributor, but that still means there's 70% coming from everything else: electricity, transportation, buildings, industries like cement, steel, etc. And here's the thing: these sectors, that's where, you know, I would argue are the greatest opportunities actually lie. So look at what China did with EVs, batteries, solar panels, critical minerals. They didn't dominate these markets because they cared so much about climate change. They saw something early on, which is that tomorrow's economy would be built on technologies that are simply better. They're more efficient, they're higher performance, they got more flexibility in terms of the energy system, and they moved fast and they dominated those markets. So when we're evaluating Canada's 2030 plan, we need to ask ourselves, are we positioning ourselves to actually compete in these sectors? Are we building the industrial capacity that's going to drive prosperity for the next few decades? I want to talk about the strategic opportunities we should be prioritizing. So first, abundant, reliable, affordable electricity. Grid expansion isn't really just about emissions, it's about attracting the industries we want. So, for example, data centers, advanced manufacturing, green steel, aluminum, and we're already seeing this work.
Monsieur le Président, je n'ai plus de traduction.
Canadian Transform... Sorry.
Chair, just a moment.
Est-ce que c'est correct maintenant?
Is it okay now?
So we got, you know, manufacturers here in Canada making transformers like Hammond Power. You know, we've seen those sectors actually grow in terms of exports by like 200% since 2022, between 2022 and 2024. We also have an opportunity when it comes to electric vehicle manufacturing. You know, the long-term reality is pretty clear. The better technology will win. EVs are just simply more efficient. They perform better. They cost less to operate. You know, we may see ups and downs, but the path is clear in terms of where investments are headed, in terms of the billions of dollars that have been spent on the sector. And we can capture that entire value chain right here in Canada. We should be increasing made in Canada content requirements, making sure our automotive supply chains are resilient, and also transformation that will set us up for the future. Third, I'm going to talk about critical minerals processing. We've got a significant opportunity here with reserves in lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, rare earth, But here's where we can create the real value is by actually processing raw ore into value-added materials. For example, if you go from lithium to lithium hydroxide, you increase the value by 4 to 5 times. And these materials also go into other supply chains like the defense systems, precision-guided missiles. All of that is going to be essential to our sovereignty and our security. Fourth, mass timber for housing. We can build housing faster with mass timber. We can also reduce carbon while doing so. The global market is projected to grow by 150% for mass timber by 2030. How do we add value to our forest products as we export it? And lastly, I'm going to say on the defense side, building the defense industrial base can actually piggyback or leverage the fact that we're building the electricity systems, grid expansion, also critical minerals. So ultimately, when we were refocusing the 2030 plan, I would argue that every action should answer 3 questions. Does this strengthen Canada's competitiveness position? Does this create long-term economic value? And does this drive the structural transformation we need towards a low-carbon future? So it's really not about pursuing necessarily the lowest cost or the easiest emission reduction in the near term, but it's about really transforming the economy so that we can build the structure required that would be part of our low-carbon future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kabara, for your remarks. And maintenant,
And now we will begin with the Conservative Party for 6 minutes, Mr. Leslie.
Dr. Exner-Perot, in your paper, High Cost, Low Returns, you argue that Canada has the potential to become a global energy superpower. Could you expand on how the Liberal production cap completely undermines that goal, particularly in terms of our international competitiveness?
Yeah, it obviously makes, first of all, if most of the oil sands companies that are the higher emitters are publicly traded. And so they are competing for capital in global markets, and people can choose not only other oil and gas producers, but any other commodity or any other sector. So they have to fight a really good return on investment to get that money. Obviously, that's been very difficult in the last few years with the policies that we've had. And having an emissions cap on top of that tells investors, I don't know if I can grow. I don't know if I can produce more in the future. With this policy, I can't. I know that for sure. So no one wants to invest in capital-intensive operations without the promise of future growth. And so that has been, even though the cap has not yet been implemented, it has really been a downer on the ability to attract investment. Even with LNG, and everyone seems to like LNG nowadays, that still increases emissions, as was mentioned already this morning. And when you're trying to go to Asia and commit buyers, to offtake agreements and spend billions of dollars, they do ask the question, how does the emissions cap play into this? Will you be able to produce that LNG that I'm now committing billions of dollars to? Can I get that offtake? Will it be producing in 15 years? There is no good answer to that question with the emissions cap in place. But for the purpose of this committee, I just want to point out in the paper, we went through it, I went through it with some economists, Canadian heavy oil, yes, is a higher emitting. It is on average, however, only now 1 to 3% higher emitting than the global average in archetype oil. So it is not exceptionally higher emitting anymore. I think that's a bit of a misnomer from 10 years ago. But the important thing for you to know is that it is less high emitting than other heavy oils. And you can't easily displace heavy oil with light oil. And so we aren't getting cleaner, Permian or Saudi to displace Canadian heavy oil. You'd be getting more Venezuelan and more Iraqi, and that has higher emissions. So on a global level, you will not reduce emissions by displacing Canadian heavy oil. You'll be creating a larger market for Venezuelan and Iraqi and Colombian in particular.
Thank you. The offset from those countries to me is a worrying proposition. The PBO estimated that the cap would cost the Canadian economy $20.5 billion by 2032, with an implied domestic carbon tax of $2,887 per ton. Can you point to any other country that's inflicting this sort of economic pain on itself?
Yeah, so in the paper, we just looked at exactly what the PBO said it would cost, and you divide that by how many tons the PBO estimated you save, and you come up with the cost for displacing every ton of carbon in Canada was $2,887. That's obviously far higher than the consumer carbon tax, which we kiboshed at $80 because we thought it was too high. So it seems a gross use of climate policy when there are so many lower hanging fruits, cheaper ways to do it. Norway's EV subsidies are extremely high. The Inflation Reduction Act had some very high values. German move to wind and solar was extremely expensive. So there's a few comparators, but I didn't find that any was as high as the emissions cap.
Thank you, Doctor. So just as clearly as you can, if Prime Minister Carney moves ahead with this emissions cap, is there any chance we can become an energy superpower in your view?
Zero chance. In fact, we will see more economic decline, absolutely. And all those LNG terminals that just got approved on BC's west coast will probably not get a final investment decision, will not move to construction.
Now, in the event that somehow we could actually find new ways to get our product to market without repealing Bill C-48, could we become an energy superpower?
We have the world's, for democracy, Saudi Arabia has good reserves, Iran does, Venezuela. We are the only democracy with those exquisite reserves of well over 100. So I know that, there's a sense that we are moving away from fossil fuels. It hasn't happened yet. I hope we do, in sense, move away from it. But you have to appreciate that even when we're about 105 million barrels a day today, even when you get to 80 or 70 or 60, you don't want all of that being provided by OPEC. You would want some democracies providing some of that oil as well, some proportion of it. And it will be Canada. The United States is obviously peaking at shale. Norway will probably have peak oil and gas production this year. The only big democracy provider that is going to be left standing will be Canada, because we have those enormous oil sands reserves. And in the Montney, we also have tremendous natural gas reserves. We won't run out here at home, but it's going to be very important for our allies that we're able to provide them with that secure supply.
You. Now, obviously,
Time is up.
6 minutes.
Oh, sorry, I have one more minute. Sorry about that.
Well, and a few extra seconds now. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, Prime Minister Carney has obviously set up the Major Projects Office, and we're seeing, I assume, a bunch of lobbying behind closed doors to get their special projects selected. From a free market perspective, wouldn't it have made more sense to simply fix the environmental assessment process that was broken by Bill C-69 and allow the private sector to do what it does best rather than politicize this whole process?
So everyone is very pleased that at least there's been a focus on major projects and on building. So that rhetoric is welcome. Don Farrell is welcome. But I would say yes, from the private sector perspective, it wasn't another layer of government bureaucracy that they're looking to. It was to rationalize all of the environmental legislation that C5 tried to work around. And the joke is the workaround only works when you're around. But we could unleash, dozens or hundreds of projects instead of just the 5 and the 10 kind of being sprinkled in here and there.
Thank you. Off to, for 6 minutes, to Mrs. Miedema.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the witnesses for your time today. I'll start with a question to Mr. Sawyer. The Conservatives like to interchange the words production cap and emissions cap in conversation, and we just heard some of that today. Can you please define for us the difference between a production cap and an emissions cap, and the role of policy in all of this, as we all agree we're striving towards actually driving emissions down? And maybe a little bit about, actually, yeah, I'll leave it there for my first question. Thank you.
Yeah, good, thank you. So the emissions cap really places scarcity on emissions and allow firms, there's flexibility in the proposed regulation to allow firms to trade and to get compliance options like exporting fuel offshore, LNG offshore, and getting units to bring home. That's sort of indicated as a compliance option that can be looked at under the regulations. So there's compliance flexibility around trading, and firms can do what they want to basically meet that objective, that cap. The regulation, the proposed regulation, asks for about a 3 megaton reduction in time. You compare that to Pathways CCS proposal, which is around 10 to 12 megatons of reduction. So that puts it into scale. One of the challenges with the studies around the impact of the proposed emissions cap is they assume the only way to reduce emissions, forget trading, getting off takes from Asia, is to reduce or curtail production. And when you curtail production, I was just pointed out, it's really expensive. It's like $800 a ton. So there are other cheaper options to comply. So if firms want to reduce production, that's a choice, but there's lots of compliance flexibility in there to keep costs down.
Thank you. I used to work for the City of Halifax and was the Director of Environment and Climate Change there, and really relied on federal policy to kind of set the stage for what provincial governments and then local governments, as well as all other players and sectors, could do to drive the transformational change that we need in Canada and around the world forward. And so much of the barriers that we would face on the implementation side were around coordination of acting all together. And I'm wondering if either Mr. Cabera or Mr. Sawyer, or maybe both, could speak to that, because you can have fabulous federal policy, and without kind of the goodwill of everyone, you can still largely fail. And so are there things that we could work towards as a federal government to improve our implementation on this urgent and transformational change, policy or otherwise? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I'll just answer very quickly here. I think ultimately what it requires alignment, right? So I think when we can find that alignment in this kind of Venn diagram where there is going to be an intersection between what's economically advantageous and what's going to be good for the climate, and that Venn diagram or that cross-section, that intersection could be different depending on jurisdiction, right? So I would argue in Alberta is going to be different than Nova Scotia and Quebec, and I think we need to recognize that in terms of the type of alignment that the federal government can have with the provinces. So, for example, if you have an oil heater in your home in Nova Scotia, as you well know, if you put a heat pump, it's a slam dunk. You're going to save money tomorrow, right? It might not be the same situation if you're heating with natural gas right now in Edmonton, right? And I think we need to recognize that if we're truly going to find these paths that are going to be practical and address the affordability issue. So I think ultimately that coordination needs to start with alignment, and then maybe asymmetrical policies in terms of how the federal government interacts with the provinces.
Really quickly, if I may. So we just did a bunch of work on looking at shared jurisdiction in the country, and by far the biggest reductions in emissions have come from federal and provincial policy that have sort of worked out jurisdiction and deferred policy, federal policy, often to the province to implement. So methane regulations are implemented by the provinces, so one jurisdiction implements it. So our success is built on shared responsibility and shared jurisdiction, and that's really the way it functions. Minimum standards, federal standards, provincially tailored to meet local needs is the way the Federation works.
Thank you for that. Mr. Cabera, you spoke about competitiveness, and there's lots of talk about a climate competitiveness strategy that's being created right now by the federal government that should come out before the budget. If you could shape the competitiveness strategy, what would you put in there, or what things would you be thinking about that are the most critical for us to be thinking about at this time?
Yeah, so I think sectorally speaking, I think electricity, EVs, critical minerals, mass timber, and a connection to the defense sectors. So those are the 5 sectors that I would kind of focus on. In terms of more broadly, one of the things we've been arguing for is what's really at the upstream for all of these things. It's a strong industrial base, right? So if you look at kind of Korea during the Nixon crisis, in the 70s, ultimately what they did is they built their upstream industrial base in terms of the chemicals industry that then led to all of the downstream sectors that they have. So I think looking at things that would build that industrial base in terms of labor, energy, R&D, innovation, infrastructure, trade diversification strategy or trade corridors. So I think really focusing in on limited but effective number of priorities, and making sure that there's an industrial base that can feed into all of these different sectors.
Thank you, Mr. Cabera. Monsieur Bonnet, à vous la parole pour 6.
Mr. Bonnet, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and welcome back, and thank you to the witnesses for their comments. And Mr. Sawyer, my first question, I think you mentioned that
On disait qu'on était aux trois quarts de
Evaluations show that we're at 3/4 of the 2030 target previously, but with a recent backsliding, we're at a reduction of about 20 to 25% between now and 2030 compared to 2005. Could you come back to that? Where exactly do we stand? And the recent backsliding, what exactly are you talking about and what is the impact of it?
Yeah, so the big policy holes are the large emitter trading systems, or the industrial carbon pricing systems, that the federal government sets a benchmark standard and the provinces can choose to implement their own policies. A number of jurisdictions have watered down the system. Saskatchewan has suspended their system entirely. Alberta just announced a bunch of changes last week, and this puts significant downward pressure on emissions. And prices. So traded prices right now in tier are below Prime Minister Harper levels, under $15 a ton. The market's illiquid with these the latest changes. So that really doesn't sort of put the long-term signal in place that we had seen. The EV availability standard, pausing that has a big deal. Yes, there's issues around sales. There's also the slowing sales had a lot to do with less subsidies available as well. And so when you look at the transportation sector, population's growing, emissions not falling as fast. You're not getting the technology uptake that you anticipated, so that's another big one. And then methane regulations in oil and gas need to be strengthened. A lot of our work was assuming a strengthened oil and gas regulation. That could be slowing, assumed a clean electricity regulation, although the clean electricity regulation really doesn't come into force to 2035, so it doesn't have much of an impact now. Sure, there's an investment horizon, but it's 10 years away. So stuff like that, there's a number of policies that we can point to, including the repeal of the carbon tax in BC and the federal.
Concerning the industrial prices for the provinces, you said that Alberta has slipped back. Should the federal government intervene to make sure that the carbon price, the industrial carbon price, is equivalent now in Alberta, for example, with the federal backstop, or Quebec, which has a ceiling, which is equivalent?
So, I'll address the Quebec question first. The Quebec system is a strong, functioning, well-organized, maintained system with all the design features you'd want, lots of flexibility to keep prices down, linked to California to keep credit costs for industry and households down, recycling back to industry or to households and industry to help with low carbon technology. So the Quebec system is very solid, the cap and trade system. The tier program, there's a bunch of technical announcements just released, and they look technical, but when you put them into the models and you look at what's going on, we see prices out in the future maybe at $65 a ton if you're lucky. And this has put an absolute chill on the market. And so the market's illiquid, we hear from traders, massive uncertainty in the system. And if we had a public exchange and transparency like we do in Quebec for the WCI, where there are announcements in California and Quebec and the price responds, the market speaks, and we see that. We really don't know what's going on in Alberta, so we don't have price discovery, we don't have an exchange. And so we hear from traders what's going on. So yeah, the market spoke, and when you tumble the numbers, it remains now well below the levels for good decarbonization or for major investment in decarb to pay.
Est-ce que actuellement en Alberta,
currently in Alberta, is the system in place as well as Saskatchewan? Is it equivalent to the federal backstop? And ought the government to intervene to ensure that the Alberta price goes up compared to what it is now?
I won't comment on what the government should or shouldn't do. But I do know the way the federal backstop is set up, it allows provinces to design their own systems to meet their needs. So Alberta has a unique system, Saskatchewan has a unique system, Ontario has a unique system. And Saskatchewan has announced they've suspended their system. So it's not in compliance with the federal benchmark, and then the government could impose the backstop. Yeah.
pour ce qui est de l'atteinte.
Concerning the achievement of the target, that the 2030 target is still possible, according to you, if there are major changes made? Could you briefly explain what those changes should be?
We
La
would
question est pour
need.
M. Cabara aussi.
Oh yeah, sorry. Sorry. Excuse.
It's for Mr. Cabrera too.
Oh, okay, go quick. So we would need emission reductions 40 megatons year over year to hit the target. It's, the Pathways project, we've been, since Prime Minister Harper or Chrétien and Premier Klein, we've been talking about CCUS in Alberta and across the country. That's 10 to 12 megatons. We would need 40 megatons year over year to hit the target. So we called it this year. I think we're offside with it. But every ton matters. And we sort of identified a number of things. So strengthen the provincial large emitter programs, tighten oil and gas methane regulations. Carbon capture can work, but we need strengthened large emitter programs. Fix the EV standard, keep the clean fuel regulations, and implement the clean electricity regulations with investment tax credits.
Thank you, Mr. Sawyer. Merci beaucoup. La parole maintenant.
Thank you very much. And now over to Mr. Bechstein for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate the opportunity. Dr. Exner-Perot, thank you for being here today. I have some questions. So even considering alternative emissions management tactics, you previously stated it's hard to conceive of a more expensive and divisive way to reduce emissions than the implementation of the current emissions cap. Can you explain why the emissions cap is really a production cap and why it's harmful in terms of investment?
Yeah, there seems to be a very big disconnect between, bureaucrats, who design these and people who actually have to work and raise money for their businesses in the system. And everyone in the oil and gas sector who has to, have buyers and sellers and investors say that this is going to result in a production cap. And whether or not there's some elegant mechanism, to choose, different offsets or that kind of thing, the fact is that their business is going to be less competitive vis-a-vis their global peers. And so this is, at the heart of all this for me, is that we are focusing so hard on reducing Canadian emissions without a line of sight on how that impacts global emissions. And you are shutting in Canadian heavy oil and Canadian LNG when the direct comparators, the orange-to-orange comparators in global markets, are almost always going to have higher emissions intensity. And actually, the oil sector has done quite well in reducing the emissions intensity. It was mentioned methane reduction has been a huge part of that on the conventional side. Oil sands barrels have also reduced by about 30% in the last 12 years. And so there are things that are working. There's TIER that is working to reduce that emissions intensity. People are trying. People have put billions of dollars into trying to reduce the emissions. But at some point, you're just not competitive. And at some point, you just give that market share to somebody else. And so it's not, most of what their business is not trading carbon credits. It's trying to produce that unit of natural gas or that barrel of oil at the lowest possible price. And right now, we have oil is about $65 WTI. Natural gas in Western Canada has been below zero, sub-zero, wrong net zero prices in the last month. How can they be competitive when you're in a low price environment, which it's a commodity cycle, it'll be a low price environment sometimes, when you're adding climate costs that probably would be equivalent to $10 or $20 on each barrel of oil. So no, it doesn't require that you shut in production, but your business is not at all competitive, not at all profitable if you have to do all these things.
Thank you. So kind of further along that vein, government's own modeling through ECC assumes only a 0.7% decline in oil and gas production under the emissions cap. The PBO projects a 5.4% loss, and the Conference Board and Deloitte estimate around 11%. And actual production trends seem to kind of align more closely with the higher estimates. From your perspective, which data set is closest to reality, and what does this suggest? Does this suggest the government is downplaying the impact of its own policy?
Good question, because the ECCC scenario is already wrong. It's already based on data that has proven to be wrong. And I think it was based on CER, Canadian Energy Regulator scenarios, which were in turn based on International Energy Association scenarios. And as most of you probably in this committee would have noticed a month ago, the IEA came back and said, you know, their current policy scenario doesn't see peak oil this decade and sees pretty much plateaus until 2050. So if you went back and put that back into the ECCC model, you would see that it was extremely ambitious. It hasn't played out that way at all. And there's a huge gap. In fact, it's trending, even the PBO numbers look very conservative and are not on track with reality here in October 2025. So it does look like the Conference Board and the Deloitte numbers were the most representative of what's actually happening in reality.
Your research suggests that putting a cap on Canadian oil and gas emissions could actually raise global emissions. You've stated this already today. You also mentioned the cost of reducing emissions this way could have up to an infinite cost per ton of carbon. Is that correct? And can you explain how?
I'll explain, yeah, because I wanted to use the infinity symbol in my paper, but the editor said it was too nerdy, so I had to take it out. But basically, when you're talking about Canadian LNG, and I think, you know, lots of people across the political spectrum are now rightfully proud of Canadian LNG, that it tends to be the very lowest greenhouse gas intensity of any LNG available in global markets. Part of that is the makeup of the Montney. It is a particularly low emitting field, low carbon intense field. Part of it is the hydroelectricity that it takes to liquefy it. And part of it is just Canada's good environmental standards, for example, the no flaring and the methane regulations. And so if you are to displace, yes, okay.
The next witness, yes.
6 minutes or 5?
5.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Next, Monsieur Saint-Pierre pour 5 minutes.
Oui, merci.
Mr. St. Pierre, 5 minutes.
Les provinces ont des cibles.
Thank you, Mr. Sawyer. The provinces have emissions reduction targets, and I come from Quebec. We have a 37.5% target. Can you say whether the provinces are complying with their targets for 2030, and does that have any impact on Canada's national target?
Yeah, target. I mean, it's a good question. I think of targets as a north star to guide policy, the policy focus, and to guide action. Most provinces have not met their targets. Quebec is because their cap's in place, is looking like they're tracking towards their target. And for me, it's really, do we have the policy architecture in place to tune emissions to get there? So repealing policy does not get you there. And so yeah, it's every ton avoided is a ton of avoided damages now and in the future.
Thank you. And Mr. Cabrera, so your latest report, Building the Future Economy, from September, you've identified key opportunities such as electric vehicles, critical minerals, clean power, modular housing, and defense. Could some of these priority opportunities get us on track towards meeting our 2030 targets and or getting to net zero by 2050?
I mean, I think ultimately they could definitely help us get to our net zero 2050 target in terms of reinforcing the types of products that we would basically reduce emissions. I think the 2030 target is, I would agree with Dave's assessment that it's going to be almost pretty much impossible to meet at this point. So I think it's still rowing in the right direction, relatively speaking, in terms of building the future system. And I believe that those actions will result in that.
Perfect. I'll move on to Dr. Exner-Perot. Nice to meet you again. I think I was introducing you at the Banff Forum about a year ago, so nice to see you again virtually. So Imperial Oil, which last year increased its dividend by 20%, and announced last week the layoff of 900 or 1,000 jobs in Calgary. And you were cited in September 30th in a CBC article where you spoke about global trends in the oil and gas sector. And I cite you, you said, this is obviously extremely painful for Calgary and extremely painful for Canada, but is part of a much broader series of layoffs. Can you explain what you meant by broader series of layoffs?
Yeah, so Imperial in particular is owned by ExxonMobil, 70% owned by ExxonMobil, which obviously is a huge American oil company. And they announced quite a couple of thousand layoffs around the world. And the structural, and we are seeing this not in just the Canadian oil patch, but you're seeing it with BP, you saw it with Chevron, you see it with ConocoPhillips. There are layoffs in the oil and gas sector because prices are very low, and it's an extremely competitive environment. And the reason prices are very low is because OPEC has been flooding the market, probably in cahoots with the Trump administration to keep inflation down. And so everyone is trying to cut the fat and survive in this market, and if you can, grow market share if you're a low-cost producer, as the Canadian oil sands are now. So the imperial cuts in particular were just a reflection of those global structures and what ExxonMobil is doing with its own business. But I guess, you know, the opportunity is to grow the economy in other ways, even as particular companies try to slim down.
Thank you. And as we know, EV sales are growing exponentially. In 2024, about 20% of new cars sold worldwide were electric. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, says that about 25% of new car sales this year will be electric, and they're projecting 40% of new car sales to be electric by 2030. If, as you said, global layoffs in the oil and gas sector are happening, does this have to do with the glut of supply or reduced demand for oil, and what impact would this have in Canada?
Good question. So actually, no, we've never seen higher global demand for oil than we're seeing today. It's really about Saudi production, using up all their spare capacity to push prices down and gain market share. But I don't think EV sales are growing exponentially, maybe incrementally. And if you take out Chinese numbers and do, American or North American or European numbers, obviously the situation is a lot more grim for EVs. But you don't have to take my word for it. This is what the EV makers and the Canadian car manufacturers are saying themselves, that the EV mandate that we have is not helping them, that is making them less competitive, that there is no market for it, that soon it's going to hit dealerships, and that they have to. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you. Je passe la parole maintenant à Monsieur Bonnet.
And now I'll give the floor to Mr. Bonnet for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I would like to know, in your inventory of emissions, Mr. Sawyer, you spoke of emissions intensity for oil and gas, and I think you said that they have not been coming down over the past several years. Is that the case?
Yeah, so since 2017, oil sands emissions the emission intensity is flat. Massive changes from 2005, but really in the last 5 years, it's flatlined. Yeah. So as production increases, you're getting a larger jump in emissions. Yeah.
Le Premier ministre mentionné.
The Prime Minister mentioned the idea of having green oil. Do you understand what he's referring to? Is it possible to have green oil from the oil sands?
I think all oil and gas and as Mo indicated, all emissions should really be controlled, or at least see some sort of price signal or have some sort of regulation that balances affordability and competitiveness, that sends a signal to manage carbon in the long term. That's the long-term signal, right? Climate damages, competitiveness on the global stage, border carbon adjustments, all these things. So we need signals to change behavior, so we all change our technology. And when a new piece of equipment comes up or a new car comes up, we flip out into something else.
Monsieur Cabarra, est-ce que actuellement...
Mr. Cabarra, at present, if we look at Canada compared to other countries around the world, are we well positioned to do the transition compared to Europe or China regarding economic leadership?
Yeah, and this is why we've been very vocal on this, because we do believe that the current moment Canada has a tremendous opportunity. We have, one of the only countries in the world where we have access to essentially all the critical minerals required for key elements of products that are going to be required in the future. We also have, the know-how and the skills in terms of converting those critical minerals and materials into value-added products. We have access to clean and abundant electricity that we can also grow. We have access to world-class, labor and talent. So I do believe we're very well positioned if we, as I mentioned earlier, pick a few areas of priorities and focus on them.
Et au niveau de, est-ce qu'on peut être...
And can we be more competitive in Canada by reducing emissions in the gas and oil sector, by investing in the transition and through innovation?
Yeah, so that's why I'm kind of emphasizing, there's a lot of conversation about that 30% of the pie, which is, we're not really focused on that particularly, not to say that it's not important, but there's still 70% that we need to focus on. And in terms of those investments, whether it's building EVs here or batteries here that can lead to reduction of transportation emissions, that's something we're focused on. So.
Thank you very much. For 5 minutes, Mrs. Asti, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Dr. Exner-Perot. When we're talking about emissions, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about this pivot that we've seen into green hydrogen. So the German Chancellor visited in 2022. He actually was right in my riding in Newfoundland and Labrador. He sought LNG, but was told that there was no business case leading to this pivot. I'm just curious where these current hydrogen projects stand, and also how Canada's decision to prioritize green hydrogen over LNG affect our credibility as a reliable energy partner.
Yeah, good question. So it was obviously infamous. German Chancellor and Vice Chancellor came in the middle of their own energy crisis as they were building their own LNG import terminals and trying to find alternative supply to the Russians, but also alternative supply to some of their Middle Eastern providers. They wanted some redundancy in supply and not all be dependent on the United States either. And of course, Canada has the resources of an energy superpower, but was not able to offer anything to our German colleagues at that time. And so there wasn't much of a business case, and promised instead green hydrogen. And actually that green hydrogen was supposed to be delivered in 2025. The MOU, that commitment with Chancellor Scholz, said that we'd be delivering in 2025. Obviously, we're nowhere near production. The bottom has fallen out of that market. There are not buyers in Germany. In fact, there's cheaper sources that they could be buying green hydrogen from in and around Europe. And so we have not seen that, which goes to the heart of where should we be putting our efforts, where should we be positioning our communities to thrive in the future, and think about doing things that have real investment, real capital, instead of focusing on hopes of some technologies coming out in the future.
And just further to that, like, what risks come with over prioritizing a technology that may not yet be market ready? What risks come to our energy sector?
Well, part of it was just the outlay of Canadian taxpayer dollars into something that didn't get a return on investment. Part of it is also the opportunity cost, though, and I think people need to appreciate when you're putting all your human capital and financial capital and political capital into untested technologies. That means that you're not focusing on building economies and businesses and firms and entrepreneurs on the other side of the ledger that might have a bit more sustainability. And of course, Newfoundland has tremendous oil and gas reserves, and that should be a huge, bigger boom for the province than it is. But obviously the emissions cap has hampered Newfoundland maybe the most, because we already have production in Alberta and Saskatchewan and BC. And so it's really growing the new production, investing in new fields, that is the most unattractive with the emissions cap. And that means that the new developments, the new fields in Newfoundland and Atlantic offshore are the last ones that will get funding in this environment.
I also, just under that vein of, governments kind of picking the pivot to green hydrogen. Now we see Bill C-5, as you've talked about, the government having the ability to pick winners and losers under this legislation. How might this deter other projects from moving forward or really growing an investment in that sort of an environment where the government has the opportunity to pick winners and losers?
So the main thing is that all the things that the C5 will allow a handful of projects, to get away from some of the bad legislation, regulatory framework, still exists for everybody else. Everyone is still operating with those bad regulatory frameworks that hamper investment. So that's the one thing. They still have the same system that we've had to deal with 10 years that hasn't produced good results. Then you also have competition, so that if a particular copper mine or uranium mine or project gets picked on the major projects office list, what about their competitor? that is seeking same capital from the same sources, but isn't on this fast track list. That doesn't seem to be very fair for anybody. Again, you know, the strategy should not be choosing 5 or 10 that the government thinks will be successful. The government should be setting a framework, an environmental landscape that attracts dozens, hundreds even, of projects to want to come to Canada and put their money to our economy.
Lastly, specifically, you mentioned our oil and gas offshore sector in Newfoundland and Labrador. What I hear, of course, is that once Bay du Nord project is up and running, then that is sort of squeezing out any future investment. Could you just briefly speak to that?
Well, I hadn't.
Time is up. You'll maybe be able to respond that response in another question. Thank you. For 5 minutes, Mr. Fanjoy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, witnesses. My first question is for Dr. Exner-Pirot. I believe I heard you correctly when you said that greenhouse gas emissions are contributing to climate change. Was that correct? Yep. So I want to imagine a not too distant future where Canada and the world is increasingly dependent on clean and renewable energy. And can you please elaborate on why Canadians, having shifted to electric vehicles for transportation, electric buses for public transportation, heat pumps, and electricity for heating their homes, why they should shift back to a fossil fuel, whether it's Canadian or from any other nationality, why they would be persuaded to shift backwards if it's going to increase greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, I wouldn't convince anyone to shift back. I would have an EV myself. I've got nothing against EVs. I wouldn't mind myself having a Tesla as part of an assortment. So no one is asking to shift back. I think it's the ones that still use fossil fuels, which, as you must know, is about 81% of the globe's primary energy source. There's no way to displace what fossil fuels do in heating. And also in many transportation sectors today. We don't have the technology to displace what they provide in those sectors. And so it's about being realistic. You know, we've often discussed that this trilemma is affordability, reliability, and sustainability. But I always say it's not a trilemma, it's a hierarchy. You have to have reliability and you have to have affordability before you can achieve that sustainability. And I think we've taken our eye off the affordability and reliability piece. We see what's happening in Prince Edward Island, where they did all shift to heat pumps. The government subsidized heat pumps. Now they don't have enough electricity. The utility is submitting emergency applications to build more natural gas-fired electricity because they are not sure if they're going to have enough electricity for all those heat pumps this winter. And so it's about not government doing top-down, heavy-handed things which inevitably come with unintended consequences. It's about making the right incentives in the market for people to choose what's best for them and have that consumer choice.
Hear from the other witnesses on the solutions that exist today for people who have adopted heat pumps and other solutions. Are they reliable? Has it improved affordability?
Yeah, I mean, I think heat pumps, specifically, I think in the case of Prince Edward Island, has been very advantageous from an economic perspective. Reliance on heating oil in Atlantic Canada actually makes Atlantic Canada one of the most expensive places to actually operate heating in your home, and even if you have natural gas, it's at the end of the line, it's more expensive. So ultimately, the problem is not that we can't service that electricity demand. We can, just about aligning the planning correctly. And I think in this case, there was a big jump in demand because people were flocking to this because of how economically attractive it was. So I think it's definitely a reliable source of heating. But I would again mention we're very careful about this because I want to be clear. It's not advantageous across the board, but it's like, how do you start with the places where it is a slam dunk, and you use that to kickstart the market transformation in terms of installers, distributors, even potentially manufacturers here in Canada, so we can do the market transformation across the board as it becomes more advantageous in different jurisdictions.
I had a place in PEI for 30 years, and the worst thing was the light fuel oil tank in the basement. I mean, it was higher insurance costs, it smelled, it was a health risk, and I think the movement to heat pumps with heating, and it didn't cool in the summer. PEI's gotten really hot, so the heating and cooling load. So look, these technologies just are kind of better and cheaper, and they just do the job.
Dr. Exner-Perot commented earlier on the reserves that Canada has in fossil fuels, particularly in the oil sands. I'd like to open this question up to all, just to talk about the clean and renewable energy potential of Canada. It's a little bit it's not a scarce energy like a fossil fuel, but I'd like to hear your reflections on the potential for clean and renewable energy relative to other countries.
A very short answer.
I mean, I think we just look at the potential in terms of offshore wind right now in Atlantic Canada, the big push there, including Ontario's expansion on nuclear and with the small modular reactors first in the G7. I think the potential is very massive.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all witnesses for their testimony today. It is greatly appreciated, and on behalf of the committee, please accept our gratitude for your contributions to this study. The witnesses are excused. This meeting will suspend while we proceed in camera.